You're listening to the Thousand Hills Podcast.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Thousand Hills Podcast, where we seek to help mindful theology become powerful faith. Okay, we're here for part 2 of Samson's life. So this is our last study in the Judges series. We're going to give the second half of Samson's life here and close out kind of the happenings of the rest of the book here. And then in the coming weeks, we'll start to follow the life of the prophet Samuel, kind of start towards the kings, David and Saul and things like that, and hopefully get a nice little overview of a good chunk of Israel's history. So, good to see you guys. So, last week we read about Samson, who was dedicated to God, and how God's Spirit fell on him, giving him great strength. But as he came of age, he didn't really seem to regard God at all. And after chasing the love of a Philistine woman due to her beauty, because again, he did not speak to her, he just saw her and was like, that's going to be my wife. Not a great way to start a relationship. After that, he went to pursue her, killed and ate from a lion. That was breaking a rule. And then after throwing a party in which he bet a large amount of money in the form of clothing, we got to see the end of our story result in him going out, being cheated. His wife basically gives away the secret of his riddle at the threat of death from the other Philistines. So he says, I'll get you your clothes, murders 30 Philistine men, strips them of their clothes, brings it back to the people who won the bet unfairly. And then our chapter concluded with verses 19 and 20 of Judges 14, and it says this. Then the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. He went down to Ashkelon, struck down 30 of their men, stripped them of everything, and gave their clothes to those who had explained the riddle. Burning with anger, he returned to his father's home. Verse 20 says, and Samson's wife was given to one of his companions who had attended him at the feast. So our last chapter ended with a bit of irony. He's disobeying God to gain what? This beautiful woman to be his wife. He goes out of his way, he crosses by a vineyard. What was a Nazirite supposed to not do? They're not supposed to eat grapes, drink grape juice, drink wine, eat grape seeds. Nothing having to do with grapes, but there he is, traveling alongside a vineyard, not where he belongs. Kills the lion, eats honey out of its gut later on. That's not a clean animal. You don't do that. Just Jews in general, right? But also part of that. And he wasn't supposed to touch dead things. That was also part of his rules there. And he does this all for this pagan woman. And then verse 20 tells us he doesn't even get her. All of this for naught, right? So kills people. Number 2, he goes to his parents. Number 3, wife is given away. So let me ask you 2 questions. Where was Samson when his wife was given away? According to our scriptures we just read. He's at his dad's house. He's not with her, right? Let me ask you this. He just went and killed 30 people. Who do you think volunteered to go tell him the news that his wife was given away to someone else? No one. No one's like, I'll take that job. They're like, I like my limbs attached to my torso. I'm going to let him figure it out, right? So it seems as though Samson did not immediately know what happened. He did all this and he hasn't even gotten the worst news yet, but he will soon. Now we go to Judges chapter 15. Who wants to read verses 1 and 2 for me?
Later on, at the time of wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat and went to visit his wife. He said, I'm going to my wife's room, but her father would not let him go in. I was so sure you hated her, he said, that I gave her to your companion. Isn't her younger sister more attractive? Take her instead.
This is a master class in what not to do as a father. Let's unpack this, right? We might be asking why Samson seems to claim her as his wife and yet left her behind at her father's home, right? Even after she was given to the other man, it seems that she is still living with her father as he shows up to the house and he was not allowed to go in. There'd be no reason to barricade a door if there's an empty room, right? She's probably still there. It is believed that there may have been a custom at the time that once a wife was married, she would continue to live with her family for a few months while preparations were made for her at her new home. And during this time, the husband would come and visit with gifts. Hence, Samson appears with this gift of a young goat, right? Only to see that she's no longer his wife. Now, Dad just delivered the bad news. He's probably not feeling real confident about his chances of survival. So being flustered and worried about his well-being, he offers his younger daughter. This may have been self-preservation. This may have been also, well, if it's another daughter, you probably have to give us more stuff. You're probably around longer to benefit our household, right? May not have just been altruism or for saving his own skin. He might have saw an opportunity to better his family again, right? Why not marry off more daughters, get more things? Samson, however, does not seem to agree that she is more attractive. He does not go, good idea, boss. And again, we don't see any inclination that he's like a man of character. He's like, no, I fell in love with this woman, the life we built together, right? He's just thinking, she's not really what I wanted. So here's what he does instead. Verse 3, Samson said to them, this time I have a right to get even with the Philistines. I will really harm them. Let's ask a quick question. Back then, what was the retirement plan for parents? Their children, not their daughters, in particular, their sons. Samson went out and killed 30 what? Men. You think he was beating down old men or killing young men? He probably ended a fair amount of families' well-beings at that point. He may have cut off some bloodlines already, and now he's going, now I'm going to do them real harm. That is not what you want to hear. So again, apparently murdering 30 men was no real harm, and Samson's anger is no longer aimed at just these individuals, but at the entirety of the Philistine people. And although we often equate extreme strength with low intelligence, Samson here does not seem to lack smarts. He certainly was not wise, no one would argue that, but what he does next is literally the BC equivalent of an economic terrorist attack. Who wants to read verses 4 and 5?
So he went out and caught 300 foxes and tied them tail to tail in pairs. He then fastened a torch to every pair of tails, lit the torches, and let the foxes loose in the standing grain of the Philistines. He burned up the shocks and standing grain together with the vineyards and olive groves.
There's a couple of questions here, all right? Number one, 300 foxes? Like, was this man just like running full strength through the forest, just like picking them off, or like?
Where is he finding?
Where are 300 foxes? Another translation suggested is jackals that do run in like big packs. Still, 300 is a huge number of any animal. Just a little bit. So, Samson decides the best way to attack the Philistines was not by killing a few of them, but by destroying the thing they required to trade and sustain themselves. Again, I have so many questions. Number one, did he do this alone? It doesn't necessarily say he did it. Number two, even if he didn't do it alone, how did he think up this plan? This is like, I don't read this in like textbooks about like common warfare. You send the foxes out. Don't see that. Number three, it doesn't say he wasn't alone. Was he lighting foxtails with the torches and sending them out one by one through the field? Did he line them up and like run with the torch to their tails? Like, how did he pull? Was there a cage involved? Like you said, these are scratching, biting menaces, right? And they're not dumb animals. He's not catching like stupid creatures. He's going out for things that we attribute wisdom to. They're wise, they're shifty, they're sleek, right? He goes out and does this. And again, Samson's anger not builds upon righteousness, but does advance the plan of God. But he doesn't do it by following the leadership of God, so there's naturally consequences. He did not pray and go, what do I need to do, Lord? He did not repent and go, you know what? This serves me right. I had no business with this Philistine woman. God saved me from this. Instead, he goes out and does something, right? And he says, I'm going to take my vengeance on these people, basically. Verse 6, here's our fallout. When the Philistines asked who did this, they were told Samson, the Timnite's son-in-law, because his wife was given to his companion. So the Philistines went up and burned her and her father to death. Yeah. Samson seems a little heartbroken here, right? The result of his lack of obedience to God and self-control was the destruction of what he loved. He had first gotten angry and gone home. Then his wife gets given away. Then he thinks maybe if I throw a big enough temper tantrum, they'll give me my wife back. And what ends up happening? The person he fell in love with is no longer there, no longer living, right? He looked at the Philistine woman and desired her, and his lack of self-control meant that even though he knew what he was doing flew in the face of God, he was still going to do it. Then again, the feast makes him angry, loses a bet, murders 30 Philistines, causes a scene, returns again so angry that he loses the bride he was seeking, and their entire family, right? In verses 7 and 8, we get to see again Samson's frame of mind here. Samson says this. He said to them, "Since you've acted like this, I swear that I won't stop until I get my revenge on you." There's nothing having to do with God here, right? Verse 8, he attacked them viciously and slaughtered many of them. Then he went down and stayed in a cave in the rock of Etam. Verse 7 shows the heart of Samson here very clearly. He doesn't for a moment consider that this might be the consequences of his own actions or of his own disobedience to his own God. He lays the blame at the feet of the Philistines as if they were supposed to act righteously. Like, that's not their MO, right? They're not playing according to the rules. As if, again, they're completely at fault for this, and he's just being reasonable and rational. Not only that, but the Philistines, again, are the overlords of the Jews right now. They have been mistreating and killing his own people, the people of Israel, and yet he doesn't swear that God's vengeance will destroy them. He says it will be his will. Samson makes this fight not about what God is doing, but completely about him. Not about the nation that has been suffering, but it's about what he lost. So he kills a bunch of Philistine soldiers, departs to the caves of Edom, knowing trouble will be following, right? He can't go home anymore. He goes home, likely the same thing's going to happen to his family. The people who run this area are now looking for him, and he's continuing to get in deeper and deeper and deeper against them. Who wants to read Judges chapter 15, verses 9 through 13 for me?
The Philistines went up and camped in Judah, spreading out near Lehi. The people of Judah asked, "Why have you come to fight us?" "We have come to take Samson prisoner," they answered, "to do to him as he did to us." Then 3,000 men from Judah went down to the cave in the rock of Etam and said to Samson, "Don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us?" He answered, "I merely did to them what they did to me." They said to him, "We've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines." Samson said, "Swear to me that you won't kill me yourselves." "Agreed," they answered. "We will only tie you up and hand you over to them. We will not kill you." So they bound him with 2 new ropes and led him up from the rock.
Perfect. So, there's something profound going on here, guys. We know about the state of Samson. By this point in the story, we kind of know where he is spiritually, what his mentality is, everything like that. What this is giving us, though, is a picture of the people behind him. All right? Our judges, to this point, have been a good indicator of where the people are. When the people are in sin, judge raises up, and they follow his lead. And after that judge, he or she, dies, then we see kind of that degrading again, right? But usually this called the people to a higher standard. Samson's example doesn't really seem to do that. Here the people are not going, "Hey, let's rally behind this guy," right? Any other story that we look at, going back to the earliest judges, we have a situation, God raises someone up. As soon as someone seems to say, "Hey, let's come together as an army and attack them," or they do something, the people rally and go, "Let's throw these people off of us. God's going to deliver us. There's hope. Here's our leader. God's going to work through them. Let's do this thing." That doesn't appear here in the story. There is no "let's rally around." What did Samson just do? He just jacked up a whole army by himself, burned down all these fields, and seemingly got away with it, right? If there was any call for these people to get up and fight back, this was it. Do they have any heart to do that? No. They seem completely defeated. There doesn't seem to be any hope for deliverance here. I would have to give it to them. I don't know that I would want to follow Samson either. He seems to be a loose cannon. But that being said, their reaction is not great. What's next? Let's build on what's happened. They look at this and go, "What the heck? You're going to get them mad at us." Israel, or at least the men in Judah here, seem to have given up any hope of salvation. Samson here seems fit to spare the massacre that will come if he refuses to go with them. So he allows them to tie him up and take him to the Philistines. And on Samson's side of things, this is probably his shining moment of leadership in Israel. He never really leads or even cooperates with people. So to make sure as to not bring trouble on Judah here is actually a pretty outstanding show of leadership for Samson. This is like bare minimum for anyone else. Samson hasn't done the bare minimum at any point. So him doing this even is like, wow, okay, there's some maturity here seemingly, right? Because verses 14 through 20 give us this. As he approached Lehi, the Philistines came towards him shouting. And the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. The ropes of his arms became like charred flax, and the bindings dropped from his hands. Verse 15, finding a fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. Then Samson said, with a donkey's jawbone, I have made donkeys of them. The King James hits different with this one, guys, just letting you know. With the donkey's jawbone, I have killed 1,000 men. When he finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone and called the place Ramoth Lehi, meaning Jawbone Hill. Pretty cool name. Because he was very thirsty, verse 18, he cried out to the Lord, you have given your servants this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? Verse 19, then God opened up the hollow place in Lehi, and water came out of it. When Samson drank, his strength returned, and he was revived. So the spring was called En Hakor, means Caller's Spring, and it is still there in Lehi. And finally, verse 20, Samson led Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines. So God again works through the unworthy vessel of Samson and allows him to cut down 1,000 Philistines. All right? No doubt a wonderful combatant here, right? Again, the potential here is off the charts. Earlier we had Shamgar, killed 700 Philistines with a bow staff. Doesn't say all at once over a course of time how he did it. I imagine he knocked a couple of them off while they went out to the bush to use the restroom. Things like that. Samson straight up just stands and delivers. Kills them, right? Only to then throw away the jawbone and recognize for a moment that he's not the hero in the story. He suddenly realizes that he's so thirsty that he can't continue on. There's no water for him to drink, which leads him to do something very out of character. What does he do? He turns to God. He prays. This is sad that this is like the first occurrence we see of this in Samson's life. This guy's just such a loose cannon that prayer never occurred to him, right? He leans on God and does what he was meant to all along, cry out to God for some sort of direction, some sort of help, right? And I find it interesting that there's almost strain in the way that Samson calls out to God. It comes across as very unnatural for him. We never find him praying and then going into battle. We never see him pray for wisdom and selecting a spouse. We never see him praying in the midst of his troubles getting worse until there's no option available to him except to pray to God. Now for the ouch part. Sound familiar, anyone? Yeah, me too. Prayer is so far down the list sometimes of things we choose to do. We make a better plan, we call for people, we hire in experts to talk about things. How long is it before we actually just hit our knees and pray to God? All right? Like, I am sad to say I have followed Samson's example in this more often than I care to admit, right? This is a good example of what not to do. We should be more prayerful than Samson was. We can easily point out many of his shortcomings. If he had a more active prayer life, again, he may have understood where he was going awry. He may have gotten out of the situation. That may have inspired some humility on his part. We just don't see that in this story, right? If Samson had any sort of connection to God beyond being an accidental tool for use, he could have spared himself immense pain and loss. He may have not only began to, but completely helped to overthrow the Philistines and led Israel back into communion with God as some of the other judges had. But alas, his moment of crying out to God and seeking him were incredibly far and few between. Even now, in this mountaintop situation, he seems to have learned nothing. He has neither greater wisdom nor self-control, and he has not gained a greater connection to God or more reverence for him when we see him next. Then we fast forward here into chapter 16. Chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. Who wants to read that?
One day, Samson went to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute. He went in to spend the night with her. The people of Gaza were told, "Samson is here." So they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the city gate. They made no move during the night, saying, "At dawn we'll kill him." But Samson lay there only until the middle of the night. Then he got up and took hold of the doors of the city gate, together with the 2 posts, and tore them loose, bar and all. He lifted them to his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron.
So, after this breakthrough moment of praying to God, what's the next thing he does that we have recorded? He goes and sleeps with a Philistine prostitute. Lessons learned, 0. Distance from sin, 0. Philistine girl counter, 2. Not to detract from the lesson of the story, but there's probably arguably no greater feat of strength than this here, guys. Bob, did they ever give an estimate of how heavy these gates were during your time of study? Yeah. It says that the lowest estimate I found was several hundred pounds. Most of the estimates were thousands. They're saying tons. Something they don't tell you about here, where he carried them from and to are 37 miles apart. And there's also, he begins at sea level and ends at an elevation of about 3,000 feet. 37 miles uphill into the edge of Israeli land, where he's like, and if they didn't know it was me, boom, they know now. My goodness. Yeah, these are like defensive fortification, all this good stuff. And he's like, I'm just going to steal this, right? He's in the wrong place doing the wrong thing. Perhaps he catches wind. He suspects that they're going to come after him. Maybe he ventured into there just to be like, hey boys, remember me? Takes the gates off the city, walks them out, right? In the middle of the night? What would that have sounded like? Post gates everything? Nobody comes out to meet him. They're like, they knew something was going on. They're like, you know what? It's all right. We'll wait till there's more men. More men. I feel a little sick. Yeah. Judges 16, 4 and 5 say this. Sometime later, and this is where we get to the last year of his 20 years of leadership, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was famously Delilah. Verse 5. Again, no lessons learned. Verse 5. The rulers of the Philistines went to her and said, see if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength and how we can overpower him so we may tie him up and subdue him. Each one of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver. Guys, by weight, this is like 450, 500 pounds. No small thing, all right? So many of us know that Delilah would be the woman who helped find out the secret of Samson's strength. And yet, how many of us realize that the Bible never says she was seeking out this opportunity? She didn't go to anybody and be like, hey, I'm dating Samson. It doesn't say that. It's more than fair to wonder if Delilah was just the second time Samson saw a woman here and fell head over heels for her. In other words, she didn't get this offer and was like, I will seduce him. There seems to be that Samson's just doing the wrong thing, and then the Philistines like, yeah, okay, we remember how this played out last time. Let's see if we can work this into our favor, right? First time, Samson. Second time, Samson's the economy terrorist who stole the gates, he's killed all of our soldiers. There's a lot of families without sons in the Philistines right now, all right? He's got a price on his head. So as he does the wrong thing again, the enemy sees an opportunity. All right? Once more, he's disobeying what's right, what he knows is right. He's completely disregarding his previous lesson about going for the Philistine females. And this time, he is famous enough again for word to get back to the leaders of the Philistines who take this opportunity to try to do the same thing that those men at the wedding feast had done. Only instead of trying to threaten, they said, let's make this a little bit better for her. Let's give her some money, right? Give her a reward for selling Samson out. Now, if he had learned his lesson, he's not in this situation, right? Fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, you know? He should not be in this anywhere near the vicinity of this opportunity. And there's a lesson here for us again, and I hate it, but it's so true. I pray personally for us that we come to understand our vices in a way that allows us to grow into redemption rather than to be dragged down into sin again and again as Samson was. Because Samson, again, is a picture of wasted potential due to his lack of, not due to his lack of ability, but due to his lack of discipline and humility. And I'll remind you that Samson's disobedience led to God calling him the start of the deliverance, not going to be the person who sees it through to completion, right? For him, he doesn't think this is a good idea. He knows that this is not the right course of action. He, at this point, just can't help himself, it seems. At this point, he's going, this is going to be terrible for me, but I just want it so bad. Again, in our lives, that's called temptation, guys. Or we know it's not a good thing, but we venture too close, it hooks us in the jaw, and then we really just can't get its hooks out of us, right? Who wants to read verses 6 through 10?
So Delilah said to Samson, "Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued."
Can we pause there real quick? Let's just talk about that real quick. Let's read that statement again. Tell me the secret of your great strength. Okay, maybe she was curious. You know, I would be curious if I'm dating someone who's like ripping gates off cities, killing lions. But okay, maybe there's some curiosity. And how you can be tied up and subdued? She must have been pretty because she wasn't smart. All right, like this is pretty much verbatim what the Philistines said. She's like, oh, I'll do it. She must have been blonde. She goes immediately, is like, almost like, here's the she must have been reading off the teleprompter and said pause at the end of it, all right? 4 more years, pause. How can I subdue you? Pause, all right? Not a smart move. Go ahead, miss. All the red flags. Verse 7.
Samson answered her, "If anyone ties me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, I'll become as weak as any other man." Then the rulers of the Philistines brought her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she tied him with them. With men hidden in the room, she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But he snapped the bowstrings as easily as a piece of string snaps when it comes close to a flame. So the secret of his strength was not discovered. Then Delilah said to Samson, "You have made a fool of me. You lied to me. Come now, tell me how you can be tied."
So, first part of the question, maybe she's curious. Second half of the question, man, is she dumb. But maybe she's joking. Then he wakes up and she's actually done it. What is left to wonder? She asks, how can I subdue you? Attempts to subdue him, and it fails, of course. Do you think the man who thought up Fox terrorism doesn't know what's going on right now? He's got a picture of what's going on, right? Oh my goodness. And again, too, I love that she asked what's the secret or like the source of his great strength. It kind of lends itself to, again, thinking that Samson didn't look like some sort of like Arnold Schwarzenegger juggernaut, right? That he might have not quite looked the part. And she's like, where the heck does this come from? Because this little string bean keeps doing crazy things, right? And he tolerates the questions. And maybe he doesn't think about the intentions. So he tells a lie. She does it. She's fooled. She's mad. And again, this for him should let him know this is not an academic question. She's not trying to impress people in the workplace around the water cooler. She's trying to hurt me. So he departs and repents, right? No, because that's not how temptation works. Temptation means to hurt us. We're aware of it. We're just kind of dumb. Verses 11 through 14, who wants to read that?
He said, "If anyone ties me securely with new ropes that have never been used, I'll become as weak as any other man."
That one's a lie, all right? They already tried that. Israel tried that. He snapped him and killed the Philistines. But
So Delilah took new ropes and tied him with them. Then, with men hidden in the room, she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But he snapped the ropes off of his arms as if they were threads. Delilah then said to Samson, "All this time you have been making a fool of me and lying to me. Tell me how you can be tied." He replied, "If you weave the 7 braids of my head into the fabric on the loom and tighten it with the pin, I'll become as weak as any other man." So while he was sleeping, Delilah took the 7 braids of his head, wove them into the fabric, and tightened it with the pin. Again she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He awoke from his sleep and pulled up the pin and the loom with the fabric.
So, literally the picture in my head is, I don't know if you guys have seen Jurassic Park 2 where that T-Rex head pops in behind like the waterfall. And like, there's Philistines in the room and Samson's sitting there. It's like, there's 7 of us, dude. We're dead. It's like in the closet, like, there's no way they feel good about this, all right? They have to be scared to death. So thank you for asking that, Bob, because that thought went through my head too. Like,
What happens to the Philistines when she calls them in? They're on him.
Apparently they hesitated. They're upon you like, let's just make sure it works. There's no word of them getting torn apart, so apparently they just like quietly whimpered and stayed there, right? They duck and covered like it was the 50s. Samson here is allowing the cycle to continue, guys. How did he fail with the first lady who wanted his secret? He allowed her to wear him down by complaining, whining, crying, and he's just like, just stop, all right? Just stop. What is he allowing Delilah to do? The same thing that broke him down the first time. There should be no mystery where this is headed, right? And it's not because he's learned the lesson of being more self-controlled. He just wants what he wants. Not only that, guys, but the cracks are appearing. What did he start with? He said bowstrings. That one makes no sense, all right? Bowstrings are not nearly as thick as like fresh rope, things like that, right? Obviously a lie. Then it turns into new ropes. Again, a lie, but hey, okay, it makes more sense. Then what's the next one? Hair. He's getting closer to the truth. He's allowing her closer and closer to what he knows he shouldn't tell her. He lied about what to do with his hair, but we can see him wearing down in real time as he allows her closer to the truth with the full knowledge that she intends to ruin him. Again, temptation, guys. Temptation. No one ever felt a temptation that they didn't know was wrong for them to partake in. When each of us falls to temptation, it's because we first laid the groundwork for it. We tolerated it for too long, and then we allowed it to wear us down to the point of compromise. For Samson, this temptation is a beautiful but wicked woman. And he allows her into his life, and then he allows her to get behind his defenses, and then he allows her to rot his resolve. So, verse 15 and 16, this is heartbreaking to me. Like the heart of the story right here that is heartbreaking to me is this. I'll tell you why. It says, then she said to him, how can you say I love you when you won't confide in me? This is the third time you've made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength. Verse 16, with such nagging she prodded him day after day until he was sick to death of it. There's some proverbs about that, all right? Delilah's not married to him. Why would she get all of the secrets, right? He hadn't told his parents the last secret and says no to his wife. This one, she's just, the side piece. So why do you think you get to know all these secrets, right? It's a foolish request from her. And yet, with enough time, we see the same behavior as before. Samson keeps a Philistine woman around. She nags him. He gets tired of it, and he caves. And it's much easier for Samson to simply add to his wrongs than to summon the strength to do the right thing. So he does that. Leads to verses 17 and 18. So he told her everything. No razor has ever been used on my head, he said, because I am a Nazirite, dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man. Verse 18, here's the heartbreak. When Delilah saw that he had told her everything, she sent word to the rulers of the Philistines, come back once more. He has told me everything. So the rulers of the Philistines returned with the silver in their hands. Guys, she didn't do this at any other point. She had bought the lies the other time. It wasn't like she was like, oh, this seems kind of fishy. She bought it. She doesn't seem smart. How does she know that he's telling the truth this time? Brings in the name of God. I imagine the way he spoke this as well. Probably less flippant, more honest and genuine. Maybe he sat her down and held her hands and looked her in the eyes as he spoke. He was no longer just being a clown or something about this, right? It's tragic because, again, Delilah doesn't even feel the need to test out his confession. She could tell that he had been honest. Again, no flippant remarks here, but he was so hungry for her affection and love that he sold himself out. He immediately tells the Philistine rulers, seemingly without any conflict in her heart. And I call this tragic because once more, his life falls in line with the overarching story of Israel. In his youth, he enjoyed connection to God. That would have brought him the fulfillment he was looking for. Instead, he looks to a Philistine woman for it. He seeks fulfillment in sex and in vengeance and rage that God would have given him hope and peace and purpose through. Instead of going to these other things, seeking out what he thought would fulfill him, if he had stayed with God, he would have had a truer and deeper version of this. Yet he's so starved for these things that he trades in his safety and any shot at securing love from this woman who never cared about him to simply go, well, this is my best chance, right? Rather than submitting to God and finding these things, finding that love that he needed, he goes to a woman who only intended him harm and he sells himself out, right? So just as Israel had chased after Baal for the things that God had given them because they desired their own lawless bliss, here Samson chases after his vices until God removes his blessing of strength altogether. Again, he left himself in a place of vulnerability. Had he listened to God, had he stayed close to God, had he followed the true calling God had on his life, he wouldn't have been so lonely. He wouldn't have been so needy. He wouldn't have been all these different things that he was, right? Instead, through habitually giving in and giving in and giving in, he basically just kills himself. This is tantamount to spiritual suicide here. Not only is he with the wrong company, but he gives that allegiance to her. He gives that trust to her. He gives away the one thing he never should have given away. What does that lead to? Verses 19 through 21. After putting him to sleep on her lap, you have to trust somebody, man. It's sad. He called for someone to shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and so began to subdue him, and his strength left him. Then she called, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He awoke from his sleep and thought, I'll go out as before and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Verse 21. Then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding grain in the prison. Guys, those shackles would not have worked previously. The fall from grace was sudden for Samson, just as it had been for Israel. The cruelty of the Philistines is no longer something only his countrymen knew, but now he got to experience it firsthand. They took his eyes, they took his freedom, and they sent him to work for their betterment in pushing a large stone to grind grain. This is the ultimate destination for anyone who abandons God's plan for their life in order to pursue other things. Money or love or power, comfort, ease, anything. If we allow our hearts to chase after what we desire rather than God, we put ourselves on a road that can only end in one thing, right? A place of chains and pain. God did not create us and call us to live in the way he prescribes to us in the Bible for his sake. He calls us to do these things for ours. He has given us a pathway to something other than destruction if we will just take it. Samson might have seen his connection to God as a burden that he didn't want to shoulder, the leadership as something he didn't want to do. But in casting that away, there was only ever really one other option to him, right? No matter what his vice would have been or how he used his strength, if it wasn't in service to God, it was going to end badly. This moment, however, would not be the end of Samson's story. And I pray that it would not be for any of us either. And guys, I preach this and it's important that we understand this so we can give it to others, all right? Even in the midst of the consequences for his disobedience, God did not abandon Samson, all right? For us, maybe we're living through some consequences, some bad decisions we made. God hasn't given up on us. But even more so, as we look at others outside of the church, this is like the number one thing I think people come into the church thinking. They think that they missed their shot. You talk to people and like, well, I went to church when I was a kid, but I've done some things now. I don't know if God will want me back. We need to be ambassadors that give this message. Look at verse 22. But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. God hadn't left him. God's still giving him an opportunity. There may have been hope in knowing that his hair was coming back, right? God wasn't done with him, even in the midst of his punishment and the things that came to him because of his disobedience, right? The enemy had destroyed Samson's life, and yet God still offered him redemption and hope. And God had a plan for Samson even after the failings and even after the willing disobedience. Because again, this was not something that he was like, what? What happened to me? He was walking too close to the fire for years before he finally fell in. For us as Christians, we need to extend that message to people, all right? There's no too far gone, all right? If you're on death row, you got a date with the electric chair, Jesus still wants to save you. You're not too far gone. God can still do something with your life, right? If we will just allow him to. And for Samson, this came through humiliation. This came through getting beaten down. Finally, the something that he was missing here, some humility in the face of God, comes to be, right? And God also, again, uses Samson here to help other people understand who he is. Read verses 23 through 27. It says, "Now the rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon," something we talked about Sunday, fishy fish god, their god, and to celebrate, saying, "Our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands." When the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, "Our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, the one who laid waste to our land and multiplied our slain." While they were in high spirits, they shouted, "Bring out Samson to entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. When they stood him among the pillars, verse 26, Samson said to the servant who held his hand, "Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, that I may lean against them." Verse 27, "Now the temple was crowded with men and women." Notice this. "All the rulers of the Philistines were there, and on the roof were about 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform." How many people were there, guys? A lot, all right? This is a mega church service today. And not only that, but it's a politically charged situation where there's a lot of rulers here, right? So as we read ahead, we have to understand the setting of the scene. There are worshipers. There's probably people who are practitioners, of this god Dagon. All these people are there to celebrate, basically, their God overcoming the Israelite God by stealing away their champion and conquering him, right? And then you have the government heads. All these people who are just there to see it, right? Samson's failure was not just being celebrated as his own downfall or as their cunning, but again, they're giving glory to another god, a false god, who they saw as having conquered the servant of the true God in Israel. They brought Samson out as a display of the might of their God in the face of the true God. And the Bible lets us know that there's a ton of people there. Then something happened. Samson did something so out of character that had he done this from the beginning of the story, his death would not have come about in this way, and he again may have finished the deliverance of Israel. Verses 28 through 30, it says, "Then Samson prayed to the Lord. 'Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more. And let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes.'" There's a heck of a lot more humility in that. It's no longer, "I will, my burning vengeance, I'm gonna." Lord, help me, right? 29, "Then Samson reached towards the 2 pillars, the central pillars of the temple, on which the temple stood, bracing himself against them, his right hand on one and his left hand on the other." Verse 30, Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than when he lived. Give a quick comparison, verse 7 to this. "I swear that I won't stop until I get my revenge on you," is what he said to the Philistines the first time when they burned down the house. This time, "Please, God, strengthen me once more and allow me with one blow to get revenge on the Philistines." Huge change in the heart there. There's a humility before God displayed in Samson's prayer here that is lacked in the last 3 chapters of his life, right? He no longer swore by his own strength. He begged God to be used. He no longer sought out his own comfort or worked by flares of anger. He now prays that God allow him to sacrifice on behalf of the name and glory of God that was being mocked there. For the first time in his life, outside of maybe sparing Judah, he does something that's not about or for him. He's not praying, "God, give me my strength so I can snap out of here, and give me my eyes back so I can go back to my normal life." He's not praying, "God, let me do this and survive so I can get glory and be a hero and live, in a cushy palace back in Israel." He prays, "God, just let me do this because they are making a mockery of you. They're making a mockery of the fact that I'm your servant. They're making a mockery of Israel right now. This needs to stop." He wished to go from the symbol of God's lack to the symbol of God's strength and vengeance, and God granted him this, allowing Samson to use the strength that he had given him once more. And as verse 30 put it, he killed more people when he died than when he lived. What's so sad about this is that Samson got to reap exactly 0% of the blessing that God would bring through this. He would live his life in entirety under the rule of the Philistines from day one till his death, and would never taste the freedom that God would later bring. And this is also, again, a picture of God's sovereignty. God worked despite Samson's heart, and yet accomplished weakening the Philistine nation through a fox-fueled attack, and had no doubt killed many of the central people, powerful people of the Philistines who had gathered in Gaza to mock and celebrate Samson's fates. So just as God had flattened Egypt in delivering Israel from them, the Philistines now are feeling the pain, right? What do you call a nation that lost a bunch of crops, has their armies constantly getting crippled, and now lost all their government heads? Devastated, vulnerable, weak, crippled, right? We have scenarios here in the U.S. that don't allow that to happen. We have a chain of command so that we never see that happen. We don't have certain individuals riding the plane at the same time so that doesn't happen, because we know how bad that would be. Samson just dealt what would end up being a death blow to the Philistines here, right? He just broke their back and they don't know it yet. Judges 16:31 says, "Then his brothers and his father's whole family went down to get him. They brought him back and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. He had led Israel 20 years." That's the story of Samson, guys. That is tragic. I don't care about Hamlet, any of these, Renaissance things like that. This is a tragedy. This is, again, just endless potential. There was no warrior like him. He's not a dope. This dude could have done so much more. But we talked about the glory thing last time. Proximity between the glory that God's supposed to have and that we end up kind of being around as the people of God. He stepped right into that stream and just thought, this is me doing it. I'm just going to do my own thing here, right? He did not have any regard for God's will or God's plan. And because of that, despite all of his great gifts, he doesn't get to see a whole lot of that blessing, right? Instead, he gets to feel pain and loss and all the stuff he worked for taken away. He's a picture of futility. There's irony in it. Yeah. Well, let's go through our epilogue, guys. We're going to look at kind of the last few chapters summarized in the book of Judges before we go on to some prophets and things like that. Following the life and death of Samson, there'll be a long period of lawlessness in the land of Israel. Samson's death does not mark a spark of hope as in Israel comes back and starts serving God, and there's no more judges that come after him. Israel has a key phrase in their history after this point. We'll read it. It's the last part of the last chapter of the book of Judges. So Samson's story ends in Judges 16. There's 5 more chapters after this, yet none of which include Judges raising up or God speaking to the people impactfully. Instead, they chronicle the wickedness of Israel. We see a man named Micah create an idol that would mislead the people of Dan for generations, and a false priesthood pop up in chapter 18. In the next chapter, we see a Levite man who has a concubine. That's not good. Levites are, supposed to be the tribe that the priests come from. Supposed to have a proximity to God, right? He has a concubine who runs away. The Levite goes to retrieve her, and in the process of returning, we see a story unfold that almost directly mirrors the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. This Levite travels to another town, Gibeon, and after being invited, and the sad part is, he travels longer to get to that town because it's a town of Israelites. He's going, I don't want to camp out with these godless people. Let's go back to the Israelites, right? What happens when he gets there? He's invited to a home to eat and drink, and then some of the men of the town demand that this Levite be brought out to them to rape him. Instead, the concubine is sent out there and is raped to death. Yep. And the rest of Israel, the Levite takes her body, cuts it up, and sends it around. And the rest of Israel is like, what the heck is going on? So they raise up after hearing this story to attack them. This story leads to a bloody civil war that ends in the destruction of Gibeah. This leads to a temporary social ban on other tribes who swore that they wouldn't give their daughters to anyone connected to the town of Gibeah, which was the tribe of Benjamin. God never told them to do this, which leads to a problem. if they don't marry anyone to the tribe of Benjamin, what's going to happen to the tribe of Benjamin? It will cease. They will lose one of the 12 tribes. They notice that and go, that's not good. So what's their solution? They allow the men of Benjamin to kidnap women from a festival who come out to dance and steal them as wives. And that's where the book of Judges ends. It ends with this phrase as well in chapter 21, verse 25. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. Samson ceased to be, but the spirit of Samson lived on strong, man. There's nothing as relativistic as can be. The thing that we're trying to champion right now, no concept for God or righteousness, right? And it won't be until the life of Samuel the prophet that Israel would be freed from the Philistines. Samson began the pushback, and it wouldn't be until after all these things transpired that we would see that breakthrough. And finally, a return to something closer to what God had called them to. So when we come back next week, we're going to transition the story of Eli and Samuel and start to lay the groundworks for where the kings will come in. Guys, did any of us know all the stuff about the book of Judges coming in? No, Precious Moments doesn't have this. There's no little cherub angels with a scroll on this one, man. There's even Bible commentaries that I've watched, like overviews, that refuse to elaborate on the last few chapters. They're just like, it's just crazy. We're just not talking about that. They're just all wicked. We're just going to leave it at that. And they just skip right over. It is that bad. All right? Book of Judges, guys, is a heartbreaking thing to watch. Right? There's a reason for it. What do you guys think we saw from the beginning of the book to the end of the book here? Where did we begin? We began with a handoff from Joshua, right? The guy who was the understudy of Moses, led them into the promised land. And their big failing was we didn't take all of the promised land. We cut deals and we enslaved people, right? They shouldn't have done that. Then we see the judges raise up when that starts to become a problem, and they fight back and restore themselves back into that righteousness they're supposed to have, right? Deborah comes in. Deborah goes, look, guys, things are bad. Barak, we need to do this thing. She encourages Barak to do what they're supposed to do. And they actually advance the kingdom of Israel. They push out these foreign nations. And then Gideon comes. Gideon's life starts really cool with the growth of faith, but it ends with them being in idolatry, with an item that Gideon made, right? They start falling back in idol worship before he's even dead. Following that, we see less and less and less of God in the lives of these judges until we get to this absolute point with Samson and beyond him, right? What are we witnessing over the course of this book? More wicked? We're watching a fall? Anything else? You're farther away from God? Two things. The first thing I see is something you mentioned as well, I touched on briefly. They start with God in his plan advancing. And then at some point they settle for just trying to stay above water. And the moment they trade that in where they're no longer really seeking God's will moving forward, they're just seeking God's deliverance, they completely bottom out, right? For us as Christians, if we are not seeking growth, we are dying. As Christians, if we're not seeking to push further into God's will, we're losing ground. That's just personally, right? Second thing for us in kind of the generational ebb and flow of the church. What was happening that these people weren't passing down what was going on? How flimsy was this understanding of God towards the end, right? It seems like there's some consciousness of God, but he seems like a foreigner the further they go in, like you're talking about, Bob. There's no personal connection whatsoever. They seem to be holding a religious practice rather than having that relationship with God. God didn't cease reaching out. God didn't cease wanting to work through them. They abandoned it. They hung up on God. They thought that if we just stay righteous enough in our actions, that we'll be okay. And what did that end up leading to? What group looked at this and decided to form their own little group? The Pharisees. The product of this was the Pharisees going, we just need to try harder, which led to the death of Jesus at their hands, right? And I think it's a proverb that says, where there's no revelation, or the people die for lack of revelation. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, where there's no vision, the people perish. There's no forward vision here. They're just trying to maintain and they perish, right? It's sad to see this book take place, and it's a good lesson to us. It's a good warning to us. But really, again, there's not a hopeful end here for them. This is going to lead into Samuel leading. This is going to lead into the kings, and this is going to lead into, ultimately, the destruction of Israel as a nation for quite a while. It was a slow fade, a callback, a slow fade, a callback until really they didn't really reach any sort of connection to God again for quite a while, until we see, the pinnacle of Samuel's career, and then until David after that. It's just a lot of empty works, right? So when I read this, what I pull out of it, guys, personally, is just, again, stark reminder, don't settle for the appearance of holiness. Sunday we talked about the God who created the outside of the cup knows the inside of it. That's full of greed and wickedness, right? For us, the transformation is inside to outside. All the judges who did a good job had regard for God. And that inner working led to outer works, right? The moment that inner thing stopped happening, like for Gideon, the outer works followed. For us, if we see our outer works not in line with God, it's a sign that there's something inner that's broken for us. That's the point to address, not just, I'm going to reform my actions. You have to reestablish your connection in your heart.
Thank you for listening to today's message. If you would like to listen to more messages like this, you can find us on Spotify and iTunes by searching for Thousand Hills Podcast. Thank you for listening to and supporting this ministry of Thousand Hills Church.